Hello gentle viewers and welcome to another episode of Ancestor Reviews It. Today I'm going to be talking about my top 10 favorite fantasy book series as of March 2021. I do reserve the right to be able to change or reorder this list in any way. I think I'm going to be doing this yearly and I'm curious to see how it evolves once I start reading more and more fantasy series. In order to count a series on this list, 1, it must be fantasy series. 2, I must have read every book that's been published so far in the series. And 3, I am not counting any single novels or any fantasy series where I've only read one book or I've only read the first book that's been out, but there's no other books out. I might have some of those mentioned in my honorable mentions. Without further ado, my number 10 series on this list is the Book of the Ancestor series by Mark Lawrence. This series takes place in a world where the two polar ice caps have been covered almost completely, like towards the middle, with ice, and only the equator is left for human civilization, with some people living towards the fringes of these ice caps. In this world, there are people with certain abilities. You can grow very much and be super strong. You can have immense agility, or you can practice the mystic arts. In this book follows Nona as we see her take part in training to be a nun and take a habit at the Sisterhood of Sweet Mercy. And she can choose between being a red sister, who are warriors. She can be a gray sister, who are people who act in espionage. She can choose to be a mystic sister, a sister who practices the mystic arts, the rarest of them all. Or she can choose to be a holy sister who is devout to the Book of the Ancestor. And throughout the series, we kind of see her explore those, go through training, and have a lot of trials and tribulations. And I think Mark Lawrence does a really good job of exploring Nona as a very unique character, and this world as a very unique world that I've never seen before. I did not expect to love the series as much as I did. It's one of those books that you start and you cannot put down. At least for me, that definitely was it. Number 9 is the Kingkiller Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss. So at this point, I consider it a duology kind of book series, with The Name of the Wind being the first book in the series. This series is told in third person by the main protagonist, Quoth, as he tells a story. So a lot of the narrative is subject to whatever the character decides to divulge or decides to structure, the arc of his story, however he decides to do so. So you might have some false narratives with this, but it's a really cool story. It combines several classic fantasy elements. It combines a lot of musical theory. It combines the whole magic school theory. It actually, one of the reasons I fell in love with the series so much is because it actually talks about money and how much things cost within a magical, world building system, because it's always a question that I've been bothered by in other books, because in other books, if they need money, money just appears, or they do a heist or something. And I think in this one, we really see the struggle of Quoth wanting something and having to earn it, both actually measuredly by training and also by actually earning the money to be able to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. And here we have a very interesting character. It's very character driven. We have a very interesting character who is somewhat of a prodigy, but he's also not a Mary Sue, because he is overconfident, because he's so good at everything. And because he's so overconfident, he makes the stupidest but also most understanding mistakes all the time, which definitely keeps the narrative tumbling along. I really fell in love with this book series and with the characters that Patrick Rothfuss created, and I really wish we had more. Number 8 on this list is the Broken Earth Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin, which starts with the 5th season. And in the 5th season, we follow 3 different characters. It can be kind of literary jarring because parts of it is told in second person. And this is the first time I've ever read a book like that. And for me, it was jarring, but also fascinating at the same time. And this is a world in which people experience seasons, but not seasons like we experience seasons. They experience apocalyptic seasons. And it looks like at the start of this that there might be a season that ends all seasons. Because there might be a season that ends all seasons. And these three different women are people who we follow. So we follow a young girl as she's coming into her own origin power. I'll explain that. We follow a young woman who is training on her origin power, and she's part of the government's origins. And we follow a woman who is married and finds out that one of her kids is completely missing. And each of their stories are completely captivating, and they're all structured within this world where people like them, people who are origins, people who can control seismic activity, are both persecuted, but they're also used as a sort of commodity in order for people to control these seasons and keep civilization going. It's incredibly intricate, it's incredibly interesting, and I would recommend it to anybody. Number 7 on my list is The Inheritance Cycle by Christopher Paolini. And this is one of my childhood favorite books, and I still have a lot of nostalgia for it. And I still think that even at this point, these books stand on their own 2 feet. And you can definitely tell how Christopher Paolini, who wrote these books at 15, developed as a writer from writing the first book when he was 15 to writing the last book later in his 20s, and how he developed his own narrative style, because he did borrow a lot. He considers it his love child towards fantasy, and I think it definitely reads like that, because he did borrow a lot of tropes from the fantasy genre. We have a dragon rider, a chosen one, who discovers an egg and becomes a dragon rider, and is destined to, at this point, defeat the big bad King Gallibatorix. And it's completely captivating, and I was definitely super engrossed into this amazing world, and I know that he plans to revisit it, and I plan to be revisiting it as well once he does that. Number 6 is a very, very new edition. It is the Locked Tomb Trilogy by Tamsyn Muir. And so this is a sci-fantasy, so it has fantasy and sci-fi elements because it's necromancers in space. It's a world in which there are different necromantic factions with kind of different necromantic powers who rule their own planets, and they rule under like a death god emperor, basically. And we follow, in the first book, we follow Gideon the Ninth, who is the cavalier, basically the defender slash bodyguard for the necromancer of the Ninth House. And her narrative is completely, it's all told in first person, so it's like we're completely inside of her head, POV-wise, and this would be a very dark and dreary tale. But we're experiencing everything through her, and I think because of her traumas, because of how she grew up, she self-defense wise interprets everything in a very funny way, which I can see some people not liking, but I completely love this narrative style. And it combined, at least for the first book, I really love the second book, which expands upon the world building, but the first book combined action, sci-fi, fantasy, and even mystery. It was incredible. I was not expecting to like it as much. It was one of the most delightful reads of 2020, and I think it's my number 2 book for my top 10 books I've read in 2020. It was that good. Number 5, I have Mistborn Era 1 by Brandon Sanderson. And let me tell you, this is one of the book series that got me really into high adult fantasy. And I often consider this to be a really good bridge for people who love YA fantasy but want to get into adult fantasy. This series is often shelved in both places and is a really good stepping off point. It's a really good stepping off point, and this world that Brandon Sanderson builds is a world in which the big bad won like 1,000 years ago, and we're all encountering the aftermath of this world. And he centers the storytelling on Vin, somebody who is very meek at first and is kind of learning her place in the world, and so we learn about the world through her eyes as well, and she's learning about what being a Mistborn, what a Mistborn is, what a misting is, what the magic system is, and because she's learning that, we learn that as well. It's really great narrative, I think, style to use in fantasy. And he builds a very, very unique world that is oftentimes considered to be one of the most solid magical, one of the most solid magic systems that people talk about now when they compare different magic systems in books. And I think he did an excellent job. Excellent job. I love these books, and they got me into the Cosmere, which is basically like the Brandon Sanderson verse. It's, oh gosh, it's so good. I would recommend it to anybody. Number 4 is the Green Rider series by Kristen. And I think that this is one of the most underrated series. I've never seen it on BookTube, BookTok, BookTwitter, Bookstagram. I have not seen it at all. And this is another one of my childhood series that I picked up. I was good friends with a girl who really liked fantasy when I was in high school, and she knew that I'd gone through a lot of my fantasy already, and she recommended this book, and I really fell in love with this book. And I often, this series, I would say, is one of my number 1 comfort reads that I go back to. The 7th book is actually coming out. By surprise, I just found out the other day that the 7th book is coming out. I just found out that the 7th book is coming out in September, and I am actually psyched to be able to read it. But the Green Rider series takes place in a world where Kerrigan Gladion is basically the heiress to a mercantile textile, not corporation, company, and she is escaping her school, her private school, because she got in a duel with a nobleman, and she actually defeated him, and he was very insulted by it. So she was afraid, so she ran away. But while she was running away, she came across a Green Rider who is a messenger for the king, who was shot with an arrow. And he implores her to deliver his message to the king, and she takes his message. She takes up the green cloak and the brooch and the rider's horse, and she tries to deliver her message to the king of Secordia. Meanwhile, she's chased down by other people. And meanwhile, she discovers powers, Green Rider powers, that she had no idea about because they're so secretive. And we follow her throughout this series as she grows and explores this world and develops. I would almost consider this to be, it's like a classic high fantasy, but it's also kind of a progression fantasy in a way that I really appreciate. It really satisfies what I want in terms of a progression fantasy, and I'm very excited for the next book. My number 3 series is Harry Potter, and I'm not going to be talking about this. So this is a series written by a very transphobic author, and all I want to say is that I really fell in love with the series when I was young. It really got me into reading. I will always have a very special place in my heart for it, but I don't want to make it too much of a narrative on my channel, especially at this point. And I do want to say that if you do want to read Harry Potter and you haven't read him before, then I would recommend you borrowing a book from a friend, or you can always go to a used bookstore and buy it, because that way you won't be supporting the author if you do not wish to. Number 2 has been one of the most surprising discoveries of my life. It's Cradle Iteration 101 by Will White. And oh my goodness, I did not expect this to be the case. So I picked it up. It's a self-published book by an author called Will White, and it takes place in a very unique, kind of a cosmos of a world, but we're focused on this one planet that's called Cradle in Iteration 101. And this place is a place where people are ranked by their power and skill set, and our protagonist is somebody who is all the way at the bottom. And not just at the bottom, he's considered unsold. His Madara channels, wherever he channels his powers from, is considered to be broken by his community. But he encounters a very powerful being who tells him that something's going to happen to his community, and he fights so freaking hard to be able to get to a level where he can actually make a difference. And we follow him throughout this series. The first 3 books are really just about focusing on him, and then the next 3 books we kind of have a little bit of wider picture, and we get more wide, more epic in scale the more Will White puts out these books, and they are amazing. It's progression fantasy at its finest. It reminds me of a kind of like Naruto. It reminds me of like an anime manga where they focus on training and training and training and getting better and better and better. And I'm always a fan of a narrative where the fantasy protagonist, the hero, works for the skill sets or powers that they attain, rather than a hero who stumbles upon those powers. So, oh my gosh, this scratched an itch I did not know I had, and I am definitely very big into progression fantasy now, and I want to read a lot more self-published progression fantasy books this year if I can manage to fit them into my schedule. Okay, now I want to talk about my honorable mentions real quick. The Traveler's Gate by Will White. I read it right after I read Cradle, and it was one of his first series, so I can tell in the first book and a half he kind of like stumbled along, but it was definitely very entertaining. And in the last book, the third book, he blew it out of the park. And I know he plans to revisit the series later, and it's within his cosmos. It's like a different planet within his cosmos. And I completely fell in love after the third book, because I was like, I've already read so many of his books. I definitely have faith in this author that it's going to be better than it is right now, and it definitely was. It definitely paid off. So if you want to read the Traveler's Gate series, the trilogy, just make sure to push through the first one, and then you will be massively rewarded. Next, I have Cirque du Freak by Darren Shan. This used to be the epitome of all books. I loved vampire books. I loved Darren Shan's twist on horror and how he would frame things. And I fell in love with the series Cirque du Freak up until the last book. And the author did something I did not expect him to do in the book. It's not problematic. It's just like a really big pet peeve of mine. And I've not revisited that series ever again. I still have so much love for it, but because of that ending, I am not going back. But it is very good. If you, I think it stands up. It's very good for middle graders. It's good for YA, and it's good for adults. I think Darren Shan is a writer for all kinds of people at all kinds of level, and the way he writes definitely touches you in different ways too. I think that is just intrinsically human, despite it being about vampires. So yeah. It's pretty good. And then lastly, The Burning Quartet by Evan Winter. I have the second book. I've actually read 100 pages into the second book, and then I had like an anxiety attack, and I put it down, and I'm going to pick it back up. I'm going to pick it back up. It's the same thing happened with me when I started Dark Age by Pierce Brown. Pierce Brown is my favorite sci-fi author, at least at this point, and I had such huge anxiety about that book. And I had the same thing with Fires of Vengeance, the second book in the Burning Quartet. But the first, it's a revenge fantasy. It's an African-inspired revenge fantasy. And it's also, I would also consider a progression fantasy too, because we have the main protagonist, Tao. Something happens to him, and he seeks revenge. And in order to get revenge against them, people who are more powerful than him, guess what? He needs to be able to train. And that's what he does. He is ruthless in this book, and I love him so much. Lastly, but also my #1 series right now, is the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. I have talked about this series, I think, extensively. I've only done a review for the latest book, Rhythm of War, but I talked about the kind of the setup and a major chunk of the first part of that video. So if you want to check that out, check it out. I really, really love it. I think it's Brandon Sanderson's magnum opus of a series. He is definitely putting all of his love for fantasy into this book series, and we follow some pretty great protagonists. We follow Kaladin, who was a surgeon's assistant, who became a soldier, who was enslaved. We follow Dalinar, who was, basically a tyrant, a dictator, and who is now trying to make amends and try to be the right, the right person, like trying to be righteous now. And we follow Shallan, who is trying to do the best for her family, who has considerable trauma, and she's trying to kind of weasel her way into a better spot in society. Oh gosh, it's so incredibly good because it gets you on so many levels. If and I think it satisfies so many genres. You know, there's comedy in this, there's drama in this, there's trauma in this, there is incredible magic, incredible progression fantasy. It just ticks so many boxes that it's incredibly difficult for it not to be at the top of my list. And I love it. I love it. I would recommend it to anybody. But I would recommend starting with Mistborn if you want a little bit of taste with the Cosmere. I would always recommend starting with Mistborn and then making your way over to the Stormlight Archive, because then it will be so much more satisfying. So that concludes my list. I also have reviews for some of these books, and I will leave those links down below. And for the books I don't have reviews for, whenever I go through a reread, I will definitely make sure to make those reviews for those, because I like to do very in-depth reviews for the books that I do reviews for, and kind of have like a really cool discussion, and I want to do it after having a more fresh perspective. Please let me know what you guys think. What are y'all's top 10 favorite series, fantasy series, and what series do you think I should pick up? I might do a top 10 fantasy series that I want to start here soon, and I would really love y'all's input so that I can make that list and see what you guys think. Without further ado, please subscribe, like, ding that bell, all that jazz, and I shall catch you guys next time. Adios, gentle viewers.